Welcome back to the deep dive. We are starting today with uh, a genuinely surprising historical nugget. It's one that really defines this massive societal shift we're about to explore.
And it all involves a man named Noel Dempsey.
Right, Noel Dempsey. Back in the 1990s, if you were in the market for heavy industrial tools, I mean the kind of equipment that shapes metal and wood, like industrial lathes, precision milling machines.
This is serious stuff.
Exactly, serious table saws. You might want to call Dempsey, a dealer based in Richmond, Virginia. And if you did, you would have found his warehouse just overflowing with exactly this type of gear.
And that's the stunning part of the story, right? Dempsey wasn't buying from closing factories, which is what you'd expect.
No.
He was buying wholesale from high schools across the country. School districts were just selling off these large, expensive, and what they saw as low-capacity shop classes.
And why were they doing that?
Well, this was happening because in the 90s, there was this massive coordinated push by educators and policymakers to prepare every single student for the so-called information economy.
The idea was to cast them all exclusively as future knowledge workers.
Exactly.
And that wholesale, systematic clearance of durable, heavy tools, it's just the perfect physical metaphor for our core mission today.
It really is.
We are going to explore the consequences of that intellectual decision. And it wasn't just a practical decline in technical skills, though that definitely happened. It was a wider, more profound intellectual and psychological ignorance of the physical world of artifacts that, we all inhabit.
We're taking direct aim at the fundamental assumption, one held by, hard-headed economists and educators alike, that manual labor is somehow obsolete.
Or irresponsible?
Right.
Or just intellectually inferior.
Right. Our core question is simple, but it cuts right against the grain of modern educational philosophy. Why is the act of working with your hands, the practice of repair, of maintenance, of building, why is it so often far more intellectually engaging and psychologically fulfilling than the officially sanctioned knowledge work that now dominates our economy?
We're asking why competence and mastery in the material world carry these unique cognitive rewards that the abstract world of the office it just can't replicate.
And we have a fantastic entry point into this entire debate, which is the personal and pretty dramatic journey of the source author himself.
Oh, it's a great story. Our sources follow a man who had everything the establishment said he should want. He'd earned a doctorate in political philosophy, and he secured a high-profile, high-paying job as the executive director of a Washington think tank on K Street.
I mean, he was precisely the kind of person that the dismantling of shop class was meant to produce. An abstract analyst, a thinker, a definer of policy.
And how long did he last?
5 months.
5 months.
That's it. He describes the job not as intellectually stimulating, but as dispiritingly abstract. He would leave at the end of the day feeling constantly tired, and that exhaustion was laced with this deep, nagging question. What tangible goods or useful services was he actually providing to anyone?
The salary was high, but the reason for his job felt flimsy.
Tenuous and undefined, yeah. That feeling of abstract uselessness eventually drove him out. He walked away from that whole white-collar career track and, pretty dramatically, opened a motorcycle repair shop.
And you have to contrast that fatigue and that abstract malaise with the specific satisfaction he describes after repairing a client's bike.
It's a wonderful sensory experience. It just highlights the utility of the work so perfectly. He describes watching the finished motorcycle leave his shop under its own power and hearing that exuberant sound of the crisp throttle.
What's the sound?
He writes it as that distinctive blah, bloom, bloom that a newly tuned bike makes when the owner opens it up and realizes the engine is running better than it has in years.
And the author takes that joyous sound as the owner's wordless salute.
Exactly. That audible, undeniable result pleased him in a way the polished, abstract memos of the think tank never, ever could.
That sound, that immediate, tangible, verifiable usefulness is what the think tank job couldn't touch. So this personal transition, it highlights the central theme here.
Right. He felt a far greater sense of agency and competence doing manual work, even dirty, demanding work, than he ever did in his high-paying abstract role. He actually found the manual work more intellectually absorbing.
Which directly contradicts all the conventional wisdom drilled into us since the 1990s.
It forces us to ask, if the most educated among us are trading policy analysis for, cleaning carburetors, what did we miss about the true value of manual competence?
Okay, let's unpack this cultural and cognitive shift. Let's dive right into the mechanics of that retreat in Section 1. The retreat from the material world.
Let's do it.
So we started, conceptually, with the disappearance of the lathe from the high school shop. And the statistics on this dismantling they're startling
Yeah.
and pretty depressing.
The primary engine behind it was economic. It's simple, really. Shop classes, with their expensive machinery and focus on safety, have a very low capacity. You can't safely supervise 50 students running power tools. It's just not possible.
And that low capacity is a huge economic disadvantage for school administrators, especially in the 90s, when they're looking to maximize student throughput.
Right. The sources detail how the push for universal computer literacy and standardized testing led directly to major budget cuts for these expensive and potentially dangerous practical programs.
So it was a trade-off. Computers in, lathes out.
A direct trade-off. For example, in California, 3/4 of high school shop programs have disappeared since the early 1980s.
3/4, that's a massive disinvestment in material competence.
It's huge. And the result of that disinvestment is this bizarre, paradoxical skill gap we now inhabit. We have a huge population of highly credentialed workers, but the trades are now constantly howling about their inability to find workers. The labor market is severely distorted.
The California Agricultural Teachers Association noted this outcome perfectly. They said we have a generation of students who can answer standardized tests, who know factoids, but they can't do anything.
They lack situated knowledge, that ability to interact competently with the physical world.
And this feeds into a really telling anecdote about community colleges. We're seeing this fast-growing segment of the student body who already hold 4-year expensive university degrees.
In things like English or political science?
Right. And they're returning to these community colleges specifically to get a marketable trade skill. Welding, plumbing, HVAC.
It's because they were sold the promise of the knowledge economy, but they found that the market is actually recognizing the irreplaceable value of practical, physical, and, situated knowledge.
They're forced to re-engage with skills they were explicitly told were beneath them.
Yeah, by high school counselors who said, "Oh, you're too smart for shop class." It's a painful realization that the abstract degree didn't confer the agency they expected it would.
Now, this retreat isn't just happening in education. It's a deliberate design choice embedded in the very objects we own, leading to what our sources call the rise of concealed artifacts and a culture of dependency.
Absolutely. The modern design philosophy, particularly in high-end goods, is to hide the works. It's an aesthetic choice, but it's driven by this desire for simplicity and non-disturbance.
What's a good example of that?
Well, if you lift the hood on some modern cars, and the German models are the classic example, the engine doesn't look like a complex mechanical machine. It looks like a featureless obelisk.
There is literally another hood under the hood.
Exactly. It's a plastic shroud covering all the interesting functional components. They are actively designing devices to be unintelligible to you, the owner.
Why? Why do that?
Because they're preventing the curious or maybe the angry consumer from interrogating the innards of their devices, because interrogation leads to understanding, and understanding leads to agency. And they don't want you to have agency.
I will see that hostility to repair and understanding everywhere.
Everywhere. Common fasteners are replaced with esoteric ones, requiring specialized, non-standard screwdrivers. You can't just open it up with a common tool anymore.
You have to contrast this hostility with older consumer norms.
It's night and day. The sources point to historical Sears catalogs, which, until pretty recent decades, routinely included detailed, blown-up parts diagrams and schematics for many of the mechanical goods they sold.
Think about that for a moment. They included detailed diagrams.
Because the consumer demand for that information, the assumption that you, the owner, would want to repair or maintain or at least understand your purchase was simply taken for granted.
That expectation of transparency is just utterly gone today. We were expected to use, replace, and remain ignorant.
So what does this decline in tool use and this concealment of functionality signal about our modern relationship with our own possessions?
It signals a passive and often very dependent relationship. If your phone or your washing machine breaks, you're conditioned to either replace it entirely or if you hire an expert.
That expert often replaces an entire expensive system, a motherboard, a complex assembly, because some minute, cheap component has failed.
Right. The repair isn't focused on fixing the tiny thing that broke. It's focused on replacing the largest modular unit possible, which minimizes the cost of specialized labor for the company. The user is entirely disburdened of involvement.
Which brings us to a profound philosophical point that the source authors really insist on. The manual stands as a moral requirement for a full human life.
This engagement with material things, the ability to manipulate and understand the world, it answers to a permanent requirement of human nature. When we demand that our devices not to disturb us, we're asking to be insulated from reality itself.
The example of the modern Mercedes models that eliminate the dipstick, forcing the driver to rely on an electronic sensor, is the perfect illustration. Why do we desire to be disburdened of involvement with our own stuff?
It's the ideology of convenience, right? The idea that technology is meant to be intuitive and frictionless. It aims to introduce as little psychic friction as possible between your intention, I want to go, and its realization, the car moves.
But that friction, that resistance of the external world, is precisely what makes you aware of reality as an independent external force, a force that doesn't just bend to your will.
If we don't engage with the mechanisms of how things work, we become more passive and less capable of critical thought. We're less called upon to exercise the mental spiritedness that's required when you take things in hand and attempt to fix them for yourself.
And the author uses the language of the trade here, pointing out that the piling on of layers of electronic bullshit in modern systems, and that's his term, a reflection of the frustration in the trades, has fundamentally changed the mechanic's job and made us all stupider by seeking maximum convenience.
So if the intellectual landscape of democratic citizen depends on getting a handle on the world in some literal active sense, knowing how the streetlights work, how the engine runs, how the faucet stops dripping, then this systemic retreat from material reality has profound intellectual and civic consequences.
Precisely. The complexity of the systems we rely on, from the electrical grid to the sewer system, only truly brings our shared dependence into view when they fail catastrophically.
Yeah.
And that common debt we all owe to the physical world, even if we live vastly different economic realities, is something the manual stance recognizes and respects because it deals with universally fixed, non-negotiable physical laws.
That recognition of the physical world as a fixed, demanding partner leads us naturally to the second section, where we explore why this engagement is so profoundly psychologically rewarding. Let's move to section 2, the psychic and cognitive satisfactions of fixing things.
Okay.
So the first major satisfaction here is the undeniable sense of agency and the tangibility that manual work provides. The effects of your work are visible, they're measurable, and often audible. The wall stands plumb, the machine runs quietly, the light comes on.
And that visibility confers a social currency that is instantly recognized, unlike the opaque metrics of the office. It's not an abstract metric on a spreadsheet that your boss defines. It's an undeniable change in the world that other people can verify.
The source describes the immense pride of a skilled electrician who bends a gang of conduit, multiple pipes running parallel into these nestled flowing curves.
It's beautiful, and he describes the electrician imagining a moment of recognition. Another skilled craftsman, maybe a young apprentice, seeing that impeccable flowing curve, realizing the skill and effort required, and just nodding in silent respect.
So the pride is generated internally, but confirmed by an objective standard of craft excellence, not by some manager's affirmation.
And this ties into a crucial philosophical concept articulated by the Russian-French philosopher Alexander Kojève,
Which is?
that the worker recognizes their own reality in the world that has actually been transformed by their work. In manual labor, you see a concrete manifestation of yourself in the world. You worked, and the object is fundamentally different because of your effort. It's a direct link between effort, intention, and reality.
This is critical because it draws a sharp contrast with manufactured self-esteem, which is so often the goal of contemporary education. The tradesman's pride is well-founded not because he feels good about himself,
But because he must reckon with the infallible judgment of reality.
the infallible judgment of reality.
If you miswire the circuit, the breaker trips. If the pipe leaks, you failed. If the engine won't turn over, you failed. You cannot interpret away a failure with rhetoric or spin. The work itself chastens any gratuitous notions of self-worth or competence that aren't backed by actual skill. The object acts as an objective external arbiter of your competence.
And this unforgiving nature of reality leads us to a fascinating insight. Fixing things can be a powerful cure for narcissism.
It's a surprising claim, but it's deeply true. Working with material things requires you to focus relentlessly on something that lies entirely outside the self. When a washing machine breaks, your immediate self-centered response, I want clean clothes now, it has to be suspended.
You have to ask, what does this washing machine need? What is the objective state of this transmission?
At that moment, the technology ceases to be a seamless extension of your will or mastery. It becomes a stubborn, broken thing, an affront to our usual self-absorption.
And the narcissist, viewing everything as an extension of their personal will, has a tenuous grasp on independent objects and is prone to magical thinking.
Right, the expectation that things should simply work because they want them to. When things break, their will is thwarted and they become enraged.
The repairman, conversely, in putting himself in service of the object and the owner, enacts a more solid sort of command.
One based on real understanding, not just personal desire. Because craftsmanship refers to objective standards that don't issue from the self and its desires, it poses a profound challenge to the entire ethic of consumerism, which values the restless pursuit of the new over cherishing what has been made and understanding its function.
So the craftsman's habitual deference, therefore, is not toward the transient trend or the new, but toward the objective and enduring standards of his craft. That objective standard, however narrow, the perfect angle, the balanced wheel, is a rare and powerful fixed point in contemporary life.
And this realization brings us to the cognitive depth of manual work, which is constantly dismissed in abstract society as purely physical labor.
But the reality is that skilled manual labor entails a systematic encounter with the material world, the very kind of detailed, empirical engagement that historically gives rise to natural science itself.
Historically, if you go back to Homer, Sophia, or wisdom, was often synonymous with skill or craftsmanship. Craft knowledge demands a deep understanding of the ways of materials. Think of a master carpenter learning wood species, their dimensional stability, their specific resistance to rot, or their grain patterns.
They gain knowledge of universals, the principles of the right angle, the plumb line, structural load, but all of it is grounded in a regard for human utility and physical reality.
And what's fascinating here is how the relationship between science and craft often runs counter to the way we teach history. We often assume science dictates technology.
But historically, technological developments often preceded scientific understanding, not the other way around.
The steam engine is the classic example. Mechanics and engineers developed functional steam engines by observing the practical relationships between pressure, volume, and temperature. They were successful practitioners of thermodynamics. They knew how it worked.
But at the same time, theoretical scientists were still tied to the conceptually flawed caloric theory of heat, which said heat was a fluid substance.
Exactly. The very success of the engine, developed by dirty-handed mechanics, provided the empirical evidence that contributed directly to the development of classical thermodynamics, fundamentally overturning the scientists' established theoretical dogma.
It gives weight to Aristotle's observation. Lack of experience diminishes our power of taking a comprehensive view of the admitted facts, which often leads to dogmatism based on few abstract observations.
If you divorce thinking from doing, you limit your ability to understand how the world actually behaves.
So the mechanic, therefore, is an active intellectual, a forensic diagnostician. The rigid dichotomy of concrete versus abstract work just breaks down completely.
As the sociologist Mike Rose noted about skilled surgeons, their work is intensely concrete, focused on physical reality, yet it relies on highly abstract diagnostic and conceptual processes.
Diagnosis is indeed high-level cognitive work. It is not just about problem solving, finding the answer to a known question, but about problem finding.
Right. You have to create an imagined train of causes for manifest symptoms. Is that backfire from a too lean fuel mixture or an ignition timing problem or a valve issue? You have to run through the possibilities.
And this relies on a stock mental library, a repository of functional kinds, their specific proclivities for failure, and subtle sensory input. The mechanic hears a sound and immediately cross-references it against every blown head gasket, every bad main bearing, and every sticky valve lifter sound they've heard over a decade.
And often, especially in older or niche machinery, that knowledge is lore-based. It's undocumented and held only through being embedded in a community of mechanic antiquarians.
The author detailed his reciprocal network with a legendary mechanic named Fred Cousins in Chicago,
who he would pay not with cash, but with deliveries of obscure European beer in exchange for encyclopedic, decades-old knowledge about specific bike failure points. This oral tradition is intellectual capital.
Here's where the practice of diagnosis gets really interesting, though. The factory service manuals tell the mechanic to be systematic, to eliminate variables, to follow a rigid decision tree.
But the manual ignores the messy, corrosive physical realities of old machines. That systematic approach is often impractical or even dangerous in the real world.
So, for example, if you need to check the condition of a starter clutch on a 1970s Honda, you might face 10 Phillips head screws that are so corroded they are rounded out and welded to the engine case.
The systematic approach demands you open it, But drilling and extracting those screws risks serious, expensive damage to the aluminum engine case itself.
So the risk of investigation now outweighs the potential benefit of confirming the hypothesis. The attractiveness of any diagnostic hypothesis, therefore, is determined in part by the physical circumstances, the corrosion, the tight space, the fragile materials, which have no logical connection to the engine's internal function, but a strong pragmatic bearing on the repair process.
So, the skilled mechanic must step back, take a larger gestalt, and circumvent the rigid instructions, relying instead on his historical and sensory knowledge to find a lower risk path to the truth. That is thinking that transcends mere rule following.
And this brings us to the uncanny experience of perception itself. The anecdote of diagnosing worn cam lobes on a VW engine is a perfect illustration of how knowledge changes sight.
The author was working with an experienced engine builder named Chaz. They were inspecting a malfunctioning engine, and Chaz, the expert, looked for minute patterns of wear-galling, faint discoloration to identify the root cause. He zeroed in on mushrooming at the tips of the valve stems.
And the author, a novice at the time, had held the same valve in his hand and failed to see it. He just saw a regular piece of metal.
It's an uncanny experience because the raw, sensual data, the light, the reflection, the surface texture, was the exact same before and after the skilled person pointed it out. The knowledge framework is essential for perception. Without it, the minute, crucial features are literally invisible.
But once they're pointed out, they suddenly seem impossible to miss.
This process is mirrored in the art of drawing, which is another form of deep engagement with physical reality. Trying to draw a human skeleton viewed end-on forces the artist to short-circuit their concept-driven perception.
The simplified Halloween display icon we all carry in our minds.
Right. And you have to attend directly to the complex, ambiguous visual data of angles and overlaps. That iterative process of seeing and doing, constantly adjusting your vision based on what the pencil is telling you, is what achieves a new level of objectivity, piercing the veil of selfish conceptual consciousness.
And the feeling of achieving that clearer vision, of seeing the world as it truly is the intense intellectual exhilaration the mechanic gets when he finally finds the underlying cause of a problem.
Indeed. It demonstrates that the mechanic's perception is not passive observation. It's an active, forensic process bound up with patterns, root causes, and a kind of ethical involvement. You look for clues only if you care about the motor in a personal, committed way.
Okay, so if the material world provides such rich cognitive and psychic satisfactions, then why institutionally and culturally did we spend the last century waging what the sources call a war on thinking? That brings us directly to Section 3, the war on thinking, from Taylorism to abstract clerkdom.
Well, the separation and institutional degradation of manual work didn't happen by accident. It was a concerted effort throughout the 20th century to separate thinking from doing. And this effort, often cynically disguised as efficiency, has been responsible for the degradation of work across the entire economic spectrum.
The central culprit here is Frederick Winslow Taylor and his system of scientific management.
And his principles, laid out in the early 1900s, were brutally frank about their intentions. The core goal was to concentrate all the traditional knowledge possessed by the workmen, all that scattered lore-based craft knowledge into the hands of management.
Management would then classify this knowledge, reduce it to rigid rules and standard operating procedures, and thus remove all brain work from the shop floor.
So the original craftsmen, who were highly skilled and knew every step of the process, were now reduced to mere executors of a manager's instructions.
And the primary driving purpose of this entire system was
Labor cost reduction. Once planning was severed from execution, skilled, high-wage workers could be systematically replaced with what Taylor called cheaper workers of smaller caliber and attainments. This process destroyed entire skilled trades by appropriating craft knowledge and instantiating it remotely as process engineering knowledge.
And the result was the complete transformation of the industrial landscape, most famously seen with Henry Ford's assembly line, introduced in 1913.
The sources recount that Ford's assembly line provoked such a natural revulsion among workers. The repetitive, monotonous nature of the work was just brutal. That labor turnover was astronomical.
What were the numbers on that?
To hire 100 men for the line, the company had to hire 963 new people over the course of a single year.
Wow.
Workers would simply walk out, often after just one day. The human cost was staggering.
But Ford's solution was purely economic.
Purely. He was forced to double the daily wage to the famous $5 day, a revolutionary sum at the time, just to keep the line staffed. He later admitted this high wage was one of the finest cost-cutting moves we ever made.
Why was it cost-cutting?
Because the high wage reduced turnover slightly and opened up new possibilities for the intensification of labor, allowing him to speed up the conveyor belts, driving the remaining workers harder and faster. By ruthlessly pursuing this economic advantage, Ford destroyed the possibility of alternative, more satisfying ways of working in the competitive industrial economy.
And here's where the historical lesson becomes extremely relevant to you, the listener, sitting in a modern office.
Because the exact same logic that degraded blue-collar work a century ago is now being systematically applied to white-collar jobs, the tyranny of process and the quantification of thought has arrived in the cubicle.
Yes, the new frontier of capitalism is doing to abstract office work precisely what Taylor did to factory work, draining it of its genuine cognitive elements. Trafficking in abstractions, moving data, writing memos, optimizing slideshows is profoundly not the same as thinking.
Right. When white-collar jobs become subject to routinization and metrics, the complex cognitive elements are appropriated, instantiated in a system, often an expert system or an algorithm, and then handed back to a new class of clerks who replace the highly paid professionals.
Sociologists like Barbara Garson noted this shift, observing that the time and motion study of the factory floor has now become the time and thought study of the office.
The system extracts the valuable thought process, institutionalizes it, and pays the remaining human executor less. Genuine knowledge work, the actual creation of new thought or sophisticated analysis, is concentrating in an ever smaller elite. The human expert who is cloned into a system achieves a kind of dominion and immortality, displacing future experts who would have otherwise learned that trade.
So everyone else becomes a mere disseminator of advice, a data handler. This creates a rising sea of clerkdom, rather than a rising sea of genuine mentation.
The author experienced this intellectual degradation firsthand after leaving academia. His job as an indexer abstractor at Information Access Company, or IAC, was theoretically a high-minded pursuit.
Right, he was surveying the frontiers of knowledge, abstracting articles from titles like Nature, Genetics, and philosophy journals for online databases.
But the job was structured entirely on the supposition that abstracting was a mechanical method to be applied without requiring understanding. The author's trainer, Monica, literally diagrammed the abstract writing process on a whiteboard, explaining that true knowledge or analysis was not required.
He describes being trapped in a debilitating contradiction, driven by accelerating quotas. His quota rose to 28 articles per day.
28.
That fast pace demanded surface-level absorption, but actively precluded the deeper, critical thinking required to actually understand the complex material. He had to suppress his ability to think, because thinking would only reveal inadequacies in his understanding and slow him down.
This physical and intellectual exhaustion resulted from being estranged from his own doings. The job required the active suppression of his sense of responsibility, both to the original authors and to the eventual readers of the database. It demanded, as he put it, a kind of dumbing down and a bit of moral re-education.
And the standards were purely internal to the abstract. Did it meet the grammar checklist? Not external or objective, like whether the abstract accurately reflected the article's true argument.
It's pure Taylorism wearing a necktie, and this fundamental intellectual degradation of work is often masked by the pervasive, optimistic rhetoric of the creative economy.
Yes. The urban theorist Richard Florida asserts that the creative class is expanding everywhere, featuring bizarre mavericks operating at the bohemian fringe, even supposedly down to minimum wage jobs.
This language makes routinized jobs sound appealing. He cites Best Buy CEO Brad Anderson's rhetoric about providing an inclusive, innovative work environment designed to unleash the power of all our people. The idea is that the teenage sales reps are reconceiving Vonage displays, a supposed explosion of bottom-up creativity.
But as MIT economist Frank Levy dryly noted, Best Buy seems to be starting people at about $8 an hour.
The unleashed power of these creative individuals is entirely compatible with a near minimum wage. If their creativity was truly valuable, the compensation would reflect it.
Sociologist Robert Jackal offers a more cynical and I think far more plausible account of this specific managerial tactic to push details down and pull credit up.
Right. Managers avoid making risky decisions that could damage their careers. They push the complex, situated judgment down to the lowest level while spinning positive outcomes as a magical bubbling up of people power.
And the liberationist ethic of creativity, this idea that it just needs to be unleashed like finger painting, is incredibly attractive because it ignores the reality that genuine creativity is not a free gift. It is a necessary byproduct of mastery, cultivated only through submission and long, often frustrating practice.
Think of a musician practicing scales repetitively for years, or the time commitment required for someone like Einstein to learn the complex language of tensor algebra. You can't skip the submission to external constraints and jump straight to the maverick part.
Ironically, this rhetoric of freedom and creativity paves the way for increasing dependence, pulling young workers into jobs that are not what they had hoped for by presenting an image of the work that is fundamentally upside down. The freedom is illusory. The constraint is real.
That brings us beautifully to Section 4, where we explore these essential constraints and submissions that form character: agency, autonomy, and the education of character.
We need to introduce Aristotle's classification of the stochastic arts.
Right. These are arts like medicine, navigation, or mechanical repair, where mastery is fully compatible with failure. The mechanic deals with things not of his own making, which are never fully knowable or predictable.
This inherent uncertainty and the frequent experience of failure is crucial because it tempers the conceit of mastery. The skilled practitioner knows they can always be wrong.
Fixing things requires a certain disposition, which the sources describe as being attentive in the way of a conversation rather than assertive in the way of a demonstration. You have to listen to the machine and let it tell you what it needs.
And this deep attentiveness leads directly to a profound moral pedagogy through physical reality.
Contending with an old motorcycle that won't start on a cold morning or dealing with stubborn farm animals served as a primary moral education because you receive immediate, unambiguous, and physical schooling when you contend with a hard reality that kicks back.
This physical confrontation chastens the will. It corrects the instinct of the raging baby who knows only that he wants. You realize your desire is secondary to the objective reality of the timing or the fuel mix.
Now, contrast this raw, chastening reality with consumer culture's ideology of freedomism.
Which promises to disburden us of all mental and bodily involvement with our stuff so that we are free to pursue our freely chosen ends, minimizing all possible friction.
The paradox of autonomy is clear here. Having an electric start on a motorcycle increases your autonomy. You don't have to futz around kickstarting it and risk breaking your ankle.
But it simultaneously decreases the bodily agency and situated knowledge that fosters judgment, self-reliance, and understanding of the machine's systems.
The marketing of choice becomes a disciplinary system promoting passive consumption. You choose among predetermined options, but you are disburdened of the basic evaluative activity that requires you to harmonize functional and aesthetic concerns, the way a builder must harmonize the needs of the structure with the quality of the materials.
So the source argues that true human agency, the deep power to act effectively in the world, arises only within concrete limits that are not of our making.
Think again of the musician. Their power of expression, their artistic freedom, is entirely founded upon prior obedience to the mechanical and acoustical realities of the instrument. The facts of physics, that having a string length raises the pitch an octave, do not arise from human will and cannot be altered.
The musician's agency is built up from ongoing voluntary submission to these external laws.
And the limits don't have to be physical. They just have to be external to the self. The philosopher Iris Murdoch described this experience in learning Russian. Confronting an authoritative structure, the grammar, the conjugations, that commands respect.
As she wrote, "My work is a progressive revelation of something which exists independently of me."
And this authoritative reality rewards focused attention with knowledge, leading the learner away from the self and its desires. This is fundamentally at odds with consumerism's ontology of easiness, which demands disposable reality devices that merely answer to our shifting psychic needs, rather than commanding reality.
Which are the durable, difficult things that require skilled, disciplined engagement, as philosopher Alan Borgman describes. Let's loop back to the ethics of attention, using Robert Pirsig's famous anecdote from Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance.
Pirsig describes the difference between the idiotic mechanics who repeatedly misdiagnose a seized engine and the good mechanic who finds the simple objective cause. The bad mechanics sat down to do a job and they performed it like chimpanzees, nothing personal in it.
They were uninvolved, like spectators following a poorly understood set of steps.
The good mechanic, however, has a profound sense of personal commitment. I am a mechanic, but his focus answers to something objective and universal. The objective truth of the sheared pin blocking the oil gallery.
It requires personal investment, but impersonal focus.
And finding that truth requires unselfing getting outside one's own head to perceive the world clearly, unclouded by ego or desire. The goal is objectivity. The author suggests that virtue is the attempt to pierce the veil of selfish consciousness and join the world as it really is. The exhilaration comes not from expressing the self, but from achieving that clarity of objective vision.
And this objective standard applies even when working for pay on someone else's property, which creates a unique ethical dilemma that our sources call the fiduciary tension.
Working on someone else's bike for pay forces the mechanic to get outside his head precisely because he knows he has to explain the labor bill at the end. This is where metacognition and ethical judgment arise. You can't just indulge your own curiosity. You have to balance the needs of the machine against the needs of the owner.
The author provides a detailed anecdote of repairing a Honda Magna V45 that had been sitting for 2 years. The owner insisted it ran fine when I parked it.
Which is a highly implausible recollection that immediately signals a coming conflict.
The initial work was simply diagnosing tight valves, requiring 7 hours of embarrassing fiddly labor just to put the covers back on. The cost was already high before the real problem was even fixed.
And the deeper tension emerged when he was repairing the clutch hydraulics. He found an ambiguously buggered oil seal. The mechanic felt an intense metaphysical responsibility to the bike itself, a powerful compulsion to dig into the problem, to fix every potential fault he discovered, to return the machine to a state of mechanical perfection.
He called this obsessive drive the motherfucker process.
But this lust for thoroughness, this desire to satisfy the objective standard of the machine's perfection, was directly and violently at odds with his fiduciary responsibility to the owner.
The owner had a limited budget, and his actual pragmatic need was just to ride the bike safely, not achieve perfection.
The mechanic realized this obsessive digging, this compulsion to fix things regardless of the budget, was actually a form of selfishness, or what he darkly called fornication of the owner's bill. He was prioritizing his personal satisfaction and mechanical ideal over the owner's economic reality.
So the only ethical solution he realized was frank talk, the necessity of the slap-in-the-face speech, to manage the owner's expectations and gain discretion before the labor hours ballooned.
This is the ethic of the old-school speed shop counter, summarized perfectly by the phrase, "Speed costs, how fast do you want to spend?"
That phrase is essentially an attempt to manage this stress. It forces the customer to check their economic logic at the door and recognize that the mechanic can't answer to the two masters' objective perfection and limited budget simultaneously without explicit instructions. It puts the ethical tension on the table.
Let's move now to Section 5, shifting our focus from the individual craftsman to the community they create, contrasting the environment of the trades with the environment of the contemporary office. We'll look at objective standards and community in work.
The essential difference between the job site and the office is defined by the objectivity of standards. In construction, an individual's worth is known independently of others because objective standards apply universally and are verifiable.
Either you can bend conduit or you can't, and this is plain. The truth is external, physical, and non-negotiable.
And this objective reality, paradoxically, creates a crew with real freedom of speech and true solidarity. Because the job itself is the authoritative source of truth, there is less need to manage appearances and less reason to police behavior. If someone is incompetent, they are exposed by the quality of their work, not by office politics.
In the modern office team, however, where standards are opaque, where the goal is often producing culture, synergy, or brands, responsibility is slippery and difficult to trace.
If a project fails, was it the manager's fault, the team member's fault, or the process? Who knows?
And when objective performance is difficult to measure, management has to shift its focus. They focus on worker mentalities requiring emotional intelligence, endless psychological measures, and behavioral conformity. The energy is spent managing anxiety, performing social intimacy, and requiring constant sensitivity training.
The critical insight here is this. Where no appeal to a carpenter's level is possible, sensitivity training becomes necessary.
If you can't rely on the concrete facts of the job, the objective reality of the plumb line or the working motor, to settle disagreements and evaluate competence, you have to police the social dynamics relentlessly.
And managers themselves inhabit a deeply unstable, bewildering psychic landscape. Sociologist Robert Jackal found that managers, facing uncertainty in their own careers, resort to using empty or abstract language to maintain interpretive latitude.
Meaning they avoid making definitive statements that could be used to blame them later. Their word is highly provisional, resembling the highly provisional and abstract language used by Soviet bureaucrats.
Conversely, the community in the trades is built on what the sources call an aristocratic ethos, a powerful regard for human excellence that is measured objectively.
The solidarity found on a crew is based on mutual regard for demonstrated skill and the objective standards of the craft. An apprentice's submission to the master's judgment is ennobling because the ideal, the perfect weld, the well-vented drain pipe, is apparent and external. The submission is to the ideal of the craft, not to the master's personal will.
The author's powerful personal anecdote in India perfectly illustrates this. He's seeing local electricians pulling wire with their stools set up ingeniously on a broomstick supported by milk crates.
And he felt his immediate oppressive sense of being a foreigner just dissolve. The recognition of shared practical activity, the specific, difficult concerns of pulling wire, created an immediate feeling of brotherhood that transcended cultural differences.
That shared, specific, skilled knowledge creates a circle of mutual regard. This aristocratic ethos leads us to look past conventional ideas of status and recognize the intellectual accomplishments of the dirty-handed mechanic.
It's an attention that is attentive and discriminatory. It recognizes true superiority in skill, rather than being a generic universalist empathy that sees no real differences in competence.
Let's look at the speed shop model as a perfect small-scale example of a community of making and using.
Speed shops function as a kind of clubhouse where work and leisure naturally overlap. The machinist sees the same crankshaft multiple times as it's perfected. The culture is based on rational activity directed toward a shared, verifiable good, speed, and performance.
And knowledge advances through a constant shared dialectic. As the saying goes, you break things and you learn something new.
The goal is clear, the feedback is immediate, and the knowledge is shared instantly because everyone benefits from better performance.
The anecdote of the sleeper bug owner is crucial here. This owner drove a deceptively normal-looking Volkswagen Beetle, but it was fast enough to light up the tires in front of the local buggy house. This act taught the author that skill and earned performance, matter infinitely more than flashy aesthetics or consumer display, show.
You can't buy entry into this world. You have to earn it through competence, leading to a profound sense of shared value and genuine solidarity.
Finally, we must consider how the trades resist remote control and irresponsibility, the very forces that define and degrade modern abstract work.
Jobs vulnerable to degradation are those that can be scaled up, abstracted, and depersonalized, making them answerable to remote financial forces rather than local reality.
The classic counterexample is 19th century banking. Local bankers relied on character and deep community knowledge, believing their interests aligned with the community's stability.
Now, contrast this local situated model with the modern mortgage broker writing bad loans in the mid-2000s. The global financial appetite for securities created an insatiable abstract demand for loans, any loan. This compelled the broker to suspend his own judgment and prudence, knowing the loan would be instantly sold off to some remote entity.
The work was effectively predicated on institutionalizing irresponsibility, which damages the best part of the professional's character.
The special appeal of the trades is that they fundamentally resist this abstraction. They remain inherently situated in a particular physical context, relying on face-to-face interactions, objective standards, and local knowledge. You cannot sell off a local plumber's competence on the global market.
The carpenter's level remains the final, fixed arbiter of reality, and that fixed point provides the basis for an unalienated, responsible work life that is impervious to remote financial manipulation.
We have covered extensive ground today, tracing the fallout from the dismantling of the high school shop class right through to the intellectual and moral compromises of the modern office.
The key synthesis is this. Real knowledge is inherently situated. It arises from direct confrontation with real things and demands a difficult but rewarding process of unselfing.
We've established that true agency is not built on whimsical freedom or autonomy from constraint, but rather on submission to objective external constraints, the laws of physics, the demands of the material, which in turn leads to moral education and a more honest, grounded engagement with the world.
And the corrosive dichotomy between mental and manual work is largely an outdated and harmful consequence of historical management ideology designed primarily for labor cost reduction.
So what does this entire deep dive mean for you, the learner, the citizen, and perhaps the future leader?
We've talked extensively about the humility required in the stochastic arts. The mechanic who makes a misjudgment and breaks a cobalt drill bit deep inside a cylinder head experiences unambiguous, expensive failure daily. This direct, verifiable failure is essential for intellectual development and character building.
And the source suggests that for many in the privileged or gifted track of education, the unambiguous experience of being wrong is often systematically edited out of their education by soft curricula and material comfort, insulating them from dependence and humility.
They are often taught to debate rather than diagnose, to interpret failure rather than accept it. We must therefore ask, if the political and business elites who now run this country were insulated from the unambiguous experience of being wrong throughout their formative years by systems designed to prioritize comfort and self-esteem, what are the implications for their fitness to exercise power and judgment on behalf of a shared material reality?
It's a question of whether our leaders understand the difference between the abstract world of rules, which can be spun and negotiated, and the hard reality that simply kicks back, where failure is not a matter of interpretation.
A powerful thought to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for
Yeah.
joining us.